This episode was brought to you by Google Cloud, a partner that needs no introduction. What you might not have heard of, though, is that Google offers a Google for Startups cloud program where they give you access to startup experts, technical training, business support, and cover your Google Cloud costs up to $200,000 for 2 years, or even $350,000 if you're an AI startup. Scale your startup faster and smarter with Google Cloud. Head over to goo.gle/Swisspreneur.
We have the Paris Agreement, which is, I would say, a soft commitment of economies. And now more and more of these countries, they put it into laws. And these laws, they are then the real drivers which make the difference, because we have to move from voluntary action to actually something which is compliant, where you don't have the choice. You cannot emit.
Welcome to the Swisspreneur Show, a podcast about startup stories and learnings from experienced entrepreneurs. If you enjoy listening to our show, make sure to follow the podcast and leave a rating. And now, here's your host, Sylvan.
Johannes, a very well welcome to the Swisspreneur Show. It's a pleasure to have you as a guest today.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm happy to be here.
You're the co-founder and co-CEO at neustark, a clean tech startup deploying carbon dioxide removal technology. Before we talk about what you do with your company and the impressive journey, I want to talk about your personal background a bit. You spent 10 years studying at ETH, and then halfway through your PhD, you started your own company. Was working for other people never really an option for you at all?
To clarify, 10 years was bachelor, master's, and doctoral degree. Otherwise, I would be typical Austrian, but I am. Anyways, working for others was always an option. But what I encountered in 2016, when I came, so in 2016, this was the year when just before the Paris Agreement was finalized, where we decided to commit to stop global warming below 2 degrees C. Mm-hmm. I figured out that there is a topic I want to work on, which was called carbon capture and storage and negative emission technologies, where actually I would say there was a lot of hope in these technologies to solve the climate crisis, but actually no one was on a commercial side really pushing forward, pushing for commercial solutions. So actually, in reality, I did not have the choice.
You felt sort of that was your calling. You had to do something.
Yeah, you can say that. Yeah, I really thought so. I want to work on something which generates impact, meaning that I would say a better world for the future. And the climate crisis is, I think, the challenge of our generation. Yeah. And there I really saw an area where I have a lot of know-how and where I can contribute. And would say entrepreneurial path was probably the only path I saw back then in making a difference.
To really make that change happen, you had to commercialize what you researched in your PhD.
Yes, exactly. So when you want to generate impact, I think the most powerful tool is to actually use capitalism. In our case, so to build a business which is economically attractive for all stakeholders in this business, make it a commercial reality, and then scale that way. So impact through business. I think that's the most powerful tool we have, and we have to use it as much as we can.
I like that, because then you can also survive on your own. You're solving a problem, there's a market for it, and you don't depend on grants or other funding. You really have something that is sustainable on its own, so to speak.
Yes, this is one thing. And then on the other side, we are talking about a scale where you cannot just fund it with grants. So we are talking about the scale of billions of tons of CO2. So like really hundreds of billions of US dollars and more, which need to be spent on this topic. So you usually cannot do it with grants. Yeah. So for this reason, the only way to solve this is really through business, through a scalable, like rapidly scalable business, which is commercially very attractive for all sides. Yeah. Like I would say, for instance, the oil and gas business, it's economically very attractive. We have to be at least as attractive as they are to compete for capital, to compete for people.
100%. So let's talk about that attractive business. In 2019, you founded the company, but you already met your co-founder, Valentin, 1 year earlier in 2018. How did that happen? Who introduced you to each other?
I was developing a technology to store CO2 permanently in demolishing concrete because I saw the greater purpose for that. And I was also openly sharing that my plan is to actually build a business based on that, which has the sole purpose to make it a commercial reality. And throughout this time, I was in my doctoral studies at ETH Zurich. Valentin was at the same time working at Climeworks, also confronting himself whether they can store CO2 in demolishing concrete and developing a business model around that, investigating whether there is a business model. Yeah. And he also shared his idea of actually founding a company to predecessor at my laboratory. And he basically matched us at his study day. So we met the first time at his study day in his apartment. And there he said, hey, Valentin is interested in founding a business, Johannes as well. And actually you're working on the same thing in the same city and have a complementary background. So yeah, let's try to team up.
What a great coincidence, right?
Yes, on the one side, it sounds like a crazy coincidence, but on the other side, I would also argue it's a forced coincidence because what happens in Zurich is that at the one side, you have the universities where you have a lot of people working on these topics. And then you had, would say, really the pioneers like Climeworks, would say very closely co-located. So would say this is the place where it happens.
Yeah, exactly. So then it actually did happen. You founded the company, you had your co-founder found and identified. You patented your technology and you also built your first prototype. That was quite a fast start. Take us back to these early beginnings, how you all started out to really make this prototype a reality and how you then took it from there.
As you describe it, it seems like the story follows quite the red line. And this was actually not really the case. Back then, right, it was like Valentin and me meeting from time to time and sharing ideas and developing it further. We patented the technology. Clearly, this was I would say, a standard procedure at ETH Zurich that if you develop something, you apply for a patent application. But I think actually the triggering moment was that we applied for a grant at the BAFU, so Federal Office of Environment, to pilot technology. So our first, I would say, commercial technology, which can carbonate a concrete aggregate at scale, so store CO2 at scale, at a commercial scale. And to actually do that, we still needed to provide a proof that we can repeat what we have shown at lab scale with a few grams, actually at pilot scale with a few tons of concrete aggregate. And for that, we designed the first plant, which was called Velaki. So it's a Velaki container. So that's the shape of this container, which was our first engineering project where we stored the first, I don't remember, maybe 20 kilograms of CO2. We basically scaled up the process from probably half a kilogram to 6 tons within one step, and that worked very well, and this also helped us to get the funding of the Federal Office of Environment, and this funding then enabled actually the next scale up, but it also generated confidence at our seed investors who actually entered afterwards and trusted that we will figure out a way to make it, I would say, a scalable business.
And I guess this was a really important proof, sort of a de-risking for the interested investor to see this is not just a really good idea, it actually works in practice, even at the small scale.
it was a bit hard for me because I was a scientist, so I usually want to study physical and chemical phenomena at very small scale in very many details. And there we did the opposite. We just figured out, okay, at small scale it works. Let's do it the next day at scale where you cannot use your hands anymore. Yeah. This generated a lot of learning for me because it showed me, so only this actually generates credibility. So we need to do that more often.
Absolutely. And I want to talk about your solution. So first of all, you started with this prototype, so to speak, or the first version, 20 kilogram. For how long will the carbon actually remain stored in the concrete?
So how does the process work? We actually bring CO2 in contact with concrete aggregate. And concrete aggregate is nothing else than concrete coming from old concrete structures, which are crushed. Mm-hmm. And the concrete aggregate has basically stones surrounded by cement paste. And cement paste is nothing else than cement reacted with water, which gives this gray stone. And if you put CO2 in contact with this aggregate, this cement undergoes a chemical reaction with the CO2 and forms calcium carbonate. So basically the mineral of which a lot of the Swiss Alps are built. For instance, the Eiger, right, is made from calcium carbonate. So it's stored for geological timescales. Geological timescales are millions of years, and the only way to release it again is basically through heating it to more than 600 degrees. And this does not happen in nature in many instances.
Yeah. So it's there for a long time. I get the message. And why is carbon storage actually so important versus just, for example, focusing on emitting less carbon in the first place?
We definitely should emit less carbon, and a reduction should be 80-90% of our action, just for the reason that, I mean, it's usually the more economical solution. Yeah. And that's true for instance, if you think about electricity, right, you can produce it through renewable energies, I don't know, wind, solar, or coal, and you should not use coal in the future, certainly. And that's true for cars. You don't need to run them with fuel. You can run them on electricity or other ways. So I would say there are many options, but then there are actually two areas where you need permanent CO2 storage. One is for processes which produce products where you cannot avoid the CO2 emission just by, for instance, replacing the fuel through some renewable fuel. And this is, for instance, cement production. Mm-hmm. 2/3 of the emissions come from calcining limestone. So heating limestone, as limestone releases CO2. You cannot avoid that other than taking the CO2 from the flue gas and then storing it permanently. And there are a number of such processes: cement, steel, waste incineration. And then you have a lot of CO2 from biogenic emitters, like, for instance, biogas plants, wood incineration plants, and so on. So you want to bring them to zero. And then you have the challenge that we actually don't talk about a CO2 neutral world, but a net zero world. So we actually don't want to increase the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, which means that the net CO2 flows to the atmosphere need to be equivalent to the net CO2 flows from the atmosphere to other carbon pools. Yeah. Meaning we have residual emissions, which we cannot just reduce to zero. Mm-hmm. And for that, we need negative emission technologies. And negative emission technologies, there are multiple ways. So one is for sure the path where we filter with the technology CO2 directly from the atmosphere and store it permanently. So you need the permanent storage component. The other one is usually that you take CO2 from, so we call it biogenic CO2. So CO2, which stems from plants, which were, for instance, trees, right, which have been incinerated. This CO2 has been taken up a relatively short time before from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. And if you re-emit it, the CO2 molecule itself is carbon neutral because you take it from the atmosphere, re-emit it, and if you store it, it's a negative emission. So for negative emissions and avoidance of emissions of, I would say, the industrial sector, you need permanent CO2 storage, and the CO2 storage needs to be as permanent as actually I would say the carbon was originally stored. So for rocks, it was a rock, right? For cement, for many other emissions, it's also, so permanent CO2 storage is the way to go there.
You mentioned cement production as one important factor, where you want to have the application going. Is that also your core customer, or who are your typical customers that you work with?
So we work today with concrete recycling plants. These are separate from cement plants. Mm-hmm. So the cement plant is where they where they produce the cement. The cement is then distributed usually to probably 30 to 100 concrete plants. Then the concrete is produced, and then you have in all urban areas where you have big construction activities, you have these recycling plants which do nothing else than crushing, so collecting the demolishing concrete, breaking it, taking out the steel, and then they either sell the aggregate as a road construction material, or in many cases they produce concrete and replace primary sand and aggregate with this recycled aggregate. And our partners are these recyclers, where we basically install the technology there. The CO2 storage plant is installed there, integrated in their process. So our value chain has in principle three key stakeholders. So one is the recycler, where we store the CO2. The second one is the biogas plant, where today biogenic CO2 in a pure form is emitted. There we also partner up and take the CO2. And then the third stakeholder is the CO2 credit customer, who purchases the carbon dioxide removal credit, and this way addresses non-avoidable emissions of their operations.
And at one point you had to get your first customer, right? So you talked about the prototype with the 20 kilogram emissions that you basically brought back and stored there. How did you then acquire your first customer? Because I imagine there was quite a gap that you had to overcome in terms of storage capacity, but also of building the trust and winning the first potential customer to work with. How did you do that from prototype to first customer?
Our first customer is the Kestli Bau AG in Bern. So I would say they are not a classical customer. They are, I would say, our piloting partner. So they helped us all the way. They were intrinsically motivated to make this happen. And what does this mean? So basically we had these, so they provided us with the material, they provided us with the space, they helped us with manpower, and they joined the whole development process from Velaki, which was this very first prototype with the 20 kilograms of CO2 stored. Then afterwards we had this mobile plant, we call it Pioneer, which actually it's a mobile container-based solutions where you can carbonate more than 100 tons of concrete aggregate per day. And it actually moved to many countries. I mean, for instance, in the Netherlands, the Dutch National Bank is built with neustark concrete. Also in Austria, it was also in Berlin. And I think most of the concrete recyclers in Switzerland also know this plant. So they also helped us in this development. We could test it with them. And then the next project, which was the first stationary plant, also happened with them, where they just said, hey, here we provide you with this silo. You can basically build your equipment around or integrate your plant. And then we tested, and that was the first commercial scale plant. I would say which entered in operation.
Amazing. And as you heard from your description, it is a complex topic. And I wonder, you do work with people who are, of course, technical and they understand and can follow you, but do you sometimes also have a bit of convincing or education to do to really, get people to move forward and to fully understand what you're doing and why it's important?
So I would say that's the challenge we're facing. So we are bringing something to a concrete recycler that in most cases we're not thinking about, or
Right.
basically we are trying to, I would say, propose a business which does not address an actual problem they have or had, but is more, let's say, an additional upside. And this requires quite some education, especially initially. I think now more and more are aware of that and really see this as an opportunity. But initially, definitely, and it's not about, I would say, purely technical things. It has a lot of components. And I think what we manage nicely is that with our operating model and business model, we take out most of the concerns they have. So I would say our operating model is built very much in a way that they do what they're best at. And this is basically collecting, demolishing concrete, crushing it, and then using it.
Of course.
And their task is to fill these aggregates in the silo and take it out again. Right? That's their task. And then we take care of everything else, which is not, I would say, within their comfort zone and is not their core business. And that's basically managing the CO2 supply, servicing the plant, taking care of the monitoring, reporting, verification of the climate impact, which results in a carbon credit, and also selling this credit such that everyone in the value chain can cover their costs and generate some profits.
And in that regard, you mentioned at the beginning how important it is to have a sort of a capitalistic success, that you make money, but also in the end, there needs to be a business case for the customers you work with. So despite the pure ideological reasons why they should do that and work with you, which is of course very important, there also has to be a business aspect. How does that exactly work? What is sort of the return on investment for your customers?
We learned that there might be one or two or three idealistic customers who just do it because they want to do it.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think that's very necessary, especially at the beginning, because you have to go somehow from 0 to 1. But then all the rest, they need to see the business case, meaning they want to earn money in the end.
No.
And they want to earn money in the end. If you cannot show them, I would say, an attractive business case, they are not going to invest, and you're not going to scale your business. Okay. The business case depends on multiple factors. One is, of course, that we pay them a storage fee for storing the CO2, but many of them can also have the ability to sell concrete at a green premium, which means that the carbon credit actually does not go to the credit customer, but to the real estate company. No. And then they are effectively the seller of the credit. And yes, and typically, I would say the payback for a customer is in the range of 5 to 7 years.
Okay, got it. So there is a clear incentive that the more volume, the more CO2 they basically store, the more money they make with your business case.
Exactly. So the more throughput they have, the more CO2 they store, the more they earn. Yeah. And I think that's a perfect alignment.
Amazing. And we also see that, you talk about certificates, you actually store the CO2, but recent history, we have also seen that this market can be challenging or even be scammed in terms of certificates out there for projects that have not really been done. On the other hand, you can also have companies that still heavily contribute to fossil fuels or sort of stop climate legislations in terms of getting more regulations in there to really push us towards this net zero approach. How does that impact your business decisions to work with companies that might still, on one hand, be a big contributor to lots of CO2 emissions versus working with them to, get these CO2 emissions stored and out of the atmosphere? Because one is good for business and the other one is the greater good, I would say.
We work with companies in the biogas and in the construction sector. And the companies emitting a lot of CO2 are cement producers. And this is process-related CO2. And I think there it's just most economical to emit the CO2. And we as, I would say, the society did not manage to set up a system yet where it's more economically not to emit the CO2, but to capture and store it. But the European emission trading scheme is there, and it's going to decarbonize the sector. That's clear. It's just a matter of timing. So the thing is that for them, it's a purely economical decision. If not emitting is more economically than emitting, then they're going to do it.
Of course.
And if they would take the non-economical choice, the thing is that the emissions, they would just be maybe stopped at one location, but move to another location. And then we also don't gain anything. And I think for neustark, it's very important that our action is not something where we delay climate action of others, or where we, I would say, compensate for emissions of the fossil fuel industry, but I would say on the one side, we work with an industry which has an emission problem, and this industry has also the justification to exist because they provide concrete. That's like really the foundation of everything. Yeah. So we are going to need this in the future, and it's an amazing material. It just has a bit of emissions. That's, I would say, the main concern. And I would say we help them to be part of the solution, and then we basically help other companies like, our customers on the certificate side. These are companies like Microsoft, UBS, and so on, and they have residual emissions which they cannot avoid otherwise. So we basically, I would say, help these industry to contribute to solve the climate crisis, not delaying climate actions on other sides.
Got it. And what role do regulations play? Because on one hand, I can really see them as a big boost for you and your business. If you have stronger regulations in some aspects, it's sort of a forcing function that could bring more customers your way, basically.
It's a societal decision. So it's a decision whether we want to stop global warming or not. And if we decide not to do so, then actually it would not be a business case. And I think important to know is that when we started, there was no voluntary carbon market. No one was purchasing credits or would have purchased credits of solutions we actually proposed. And I think, how did it develop? We have the Paris Agreement, which is, I would say, a soft commitment of the relevant economies. And now they more and more of these countries, they put it into laws. And these laws, they are then the real drivers, which make the difference, because we have to move from voluntary action to actually something which is compliant, where you don't have the choice. So you cannot emit.
Exactly.
Otherwise we don't reach our goals. And I think it's this transition we are currently in, but it's a big challenge because it means change for everybody to a certain degree.
Yeah, and changing stuff that they have done that certain way for many, many years. And that's always especially difficult, I imagine.
Yeah, so maybe that's a bit perception, but actually I think in real life, every company is used to constant change. No. So it's nothing else than the usual operating mode that they need to, that every company, every employee needs to adjust to the new conditions, which is I think an ongoing process since humans are on this planet.
And whether it's to stay ahead and manage constant change, or if it's getting our society, our planet to net zero, there's a certain thing you need to get stuff done. And that's also something that you as an entrepreneur face. So this is sort of the last sort of challenging part I want to talk about. You could do many, many things at the same time, but you also need to focus on certain things. So how do you run your company? How do you make sure that you actually get stuff done with you and your team?
When we started, we had an excellent setup. So I was the technical guy with, I would say, many ideas and a good understanding of the technology, and then Valentin, the commercial guy who helped finding the right focus and cut things which are, would say, nice to have, but not necessary. I would say this was the initial setup, probably very challenging for us both, because we had to, we learned a lot about ourselves. Yeah. As the organization grows, so as you're 10 people, everybody still talks with everyone every day. But as the organization grows to 20, 30, 40 people, this needs to be, so this changes. Yeah. And what we did is that we actually introduced, I would say, a management method or a target setting method, the objectives and key results, beginning of last year, when we have been roughly 20 people. And so would say this is that's would say quite a common method among startups, but also larger corporates. And how we do it is that we have, on the one side, we have our vision, which is the 1 megaton of CO2 removed in the year 2030. And then we set on the company level a 3-year objective and then a 1-year objective. And then from that we derive basically for the company and every team quarterly objectives and key results. And every quarter we basically, we have weekly, I would say weekly one-on-one meetings, weekly team meetings. And then at the end of the quarter we check where we are, right? Take in the learnings. And then we set new goals for the new objectives and new key results for the next quarter. And this helps us to move quickly and to integrate learnings quickly. Because what happens in a fast-growing company is that things you did 3 months ago might not be meaningful any longer. And you might need to drop them.
100%. I love how you drill down the process. Give us an example, like what is your annual objective for 2024?
So I would say the big thing we want to achieve is that we want to remove, so important to mention is we always set stretch goals, right? Yeah. We set a goal where we say, okay, that's realistic, and then we stretch it by something like 30%. I would say along the lines that if you hit for the moon, you never end up on the Mars. Yeah. So you have to target the Mars to reach moon.
Exactly.
So I would say our big stretch goal around which we designed our objectives and key results this year is that we said we want to remove this year 10,000 tons of CO2. Yeah. And that's roughly 10 times as much as the past 3 years together.
Wow. That's a steep growth. And how do you then break this annual goal down into quarterly objectives and key results? Can you also give us an example there?
Yeah. So what we did then is that basically the whole organization is meeting at one location at the headquarters in Bern. Then we have basically a 1-day workshop where before this 1-day workshop, the management team breaks this down in objectives and key results for the company. And then in these 1-day workshops, the individual teams, they set up their objectives and key results. And I think, so very important there is that it's a mix of a top-down method and a bottom-up method, because top-down, we know, I would say, the direction we want to go, and bottom up, people know how to get there because they have all this know-how, and we have so many bright minds. We need to use that. So actually they tell us how we get there. Yeah. And I would say this way we managed to do that very well so we have, I would say, these objectives and key results on a team level, but also individual people have their own objectives and key results, and this combination I think works very well.
So it is annual goal for the company or objective, then you do quarterly company-wide OKRs, then the teams take on OKRs, and even the individual members of the team then create their own OKRs to contribute to the team's OKRs.
So the individual members, they contribute to the team OKRs, and then they have individual objectives which can contribute to the team OKRs, but they can also contribute to any other OKRs. We have quite different departments. We have, for instance, sales, where it's relatively easy. You want to generate, you want to sign certain contract volumes, for instance, short term. And then on the other hand, you have, for instance, R&D, where probably you have to align your activities more longer term, not on on longer term objectives.
Absolutely. And how do you keep track of all these different objectives on team, individual, but also company level? Do you use any specific tool to visualize and track them across the company?
We use Excel.
That's fine. Yeah, it works. It does the trick, right?
No, it still works. We are 60 people, so that still works fine. And and people need to report weekly on where they are on the journey.
Perfect. And now you mentioned before this ambitious goal of, removing 1 million, I think, or 1 gigaton, you said, CO2 in the year 2030. So that is a very ambitious goal, and it's probably quite a significant higher growth to where you are today. How much are you on track to get there?
We have a roadmap where the tons are, I would say, or where we have very specific targets, how much plants we need to have up and running until when. And this what this essentially means is that we need to build up an organization which can deliver according to these goals. And this means that we need to, at the one side, ramp up our sales team, ramp up our operations team, grow internationally. We now already are operating in 7 different regional areas. One is Switzerland, Vienna, Cologne, Paris, London, Berlin, and so on. So I would say we are on track. It's a challenge, definitely. So it's not for free building such an organization, but you also have to consider that it's kind of an exponential growth, right? We are growing. We grew last year 250%.
Wow.
Our year-over-year growth is going to be most years somewhere between 100 and 200%. So it's an exponential growth, and the bigger the organization is, the faster you can grow, and also the more customer exposure you have.
Of course. And along that journey, it's a very ambitious goal that you're targeting there. Have you ever thought about giving up along the journey, where you said, hey, this will not work, or I've seen enough, let's just do something different?
So you said very, very ambitious goal. It's for sure ambitious, but the 1 million tons of CO2 removed alone is not meaningful. I think that's important. So what's the meaning of this goal? The meaning is that if we reach the megaton in 2030, or technologies which can prove that they operate at a megaton scale in 2030, they have the potential to scale to a size that they can generate a relevant climate impact in 2050. So let's say more than 100 million tons of CO2 removal per year. Mm-hmm. If you don't hit the megaton, you're going to be too late. So you're going to come too late. That's, I would say, the meaning of this goal. And no, I was never thinking about giving up, because it's a crazy and amazing journey. I want to contribute stopping global warming, and I think we are on a good pathway to be a big player there.
Fantastic. I also want to ask you some rapid fire questions now to wrap up the conversation. Following up on what you just said, what is your personally biggest ecological sin?
Being an inhabitant of a wealthy country like Switzerland. So and also and having a small family. I think that's probably the biggest impact I have.
And what gives you hope, besides neustark, of course, when it comes to climate change and to fixing it?
What gives me hope is that there are a lot of young talents which want to make this change happen, and they will.
Nice. If you had to choose researcher or entrepreneur?
I would say today I say entrepreneur, because I think entrepreneur has also a lot of research components coupled with purpose.
Absolutely. And what is your favorite neustark memory so far?
The plant opening in Berlin. So let me elaborate on that. We had the first CO2 storage plant in the European Union was opened last year in Berlin. We had a big opening event inviting more than 100 people. And the spirit of this event was just amazing, because all people were there and said, hey, let's make a change, let's make it happen. And it was, I would say, this was just amazing to experience.
I can see that this was really something special for you by just looking at you. And I'm sure it was not the last plant opening that you did. So there are hopefully many more to come in the future. Johannes, thank you so much for coming on the show. Lots of success and all the best. And thank you for what you're doing and for this very important contribution.
Thanks a lot for the invitation, and very nice talking to you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, you can support us by rating our show on Apple Podcasts. This way, we can reach an ever-growing number of aspiring entrepreneurs.